This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Thank you for watching NC Spin. Not only is this our last show of the year, it's also NC Spin's last show. So as is our tradition, we're going to highlight the stories we talked about during 2020 and give their impact at year's end. We'll also name our NC Spin Tar Heel of the Year, and we'll ask the panelists for some observations about the impact of our show. Speaking of the panel, this week they include Joe Mavretic, former House Speaker, Becki Gray, Vice President of the John Locke Foundation, Chris Fitzsimon, Director of the state's Newsroom, and John Hood, Syndicated columnist and author. We'll begin our uninterrupted discussion after these brief messages from our underwriters. In more than 21 years on NC Spin, I never endorsed a product or sponsor, but I volunteered to do this message for family physicians. Over the past 40 years, my family doctor could quickly diagnose my illnesses because he knew my medical history. Evidence suggests I'll live longer, have a higher quality of life, and save 33% on health care costs. I believe in my trusted relationship with my family physician.
Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Your life is more flexible and efficient than ever, and your energy is too. See how North Carolina's electric cooperatives are building a brighter future for the rural communities we serve at ncelectriccooperatives.com/brighter.
Unlike some years in the past, it wasn't hard to go back through our scripts from this past year to discover what had occupied our attention during most of the year. Let's acknowledge the big three: the virus, the elections, and racial unrest. There are also some other issues, so let's review the year 2020. The first time we mentioned COVID-19 was on our Friday the 13th show in March. Little did we know it was going to dominate our discussions throughout the year. Becki Gray, when the history of this year is written, how will historians say COVID impacted this year?
It impacted everything. It impacted the elections. It impacted the unrest, as you mentioned, Tom. It's impacted the economy, people's jobs, their livelihoods, businesses. It's impacted education, how our kids are learning, what we're going to be left with that. And it's also impacted our health care. Not only dealing with those who have come down with COVID and are dealing with that, our healthcare workers, our frontline workers, our medical providers, and also the residuals of that, the mental health issues that we're seeing as this drags on and on and on for so many months. The pandemic, the COVID, how we've handled it, it has had an impact on every single aspect of our lives. This will be the only thing that will be remembered. Everything that's remembered about 2020 will be done through the lens of the pandemic.
No question about it. And Chris, from the outset, there were a lot of people who just didn't really think this was such a big deal, that very few people were going to get it. Even fewer people were going to die from it. We're now up into 6,000 deaths and 100,000 or so people in our state that have been affected by this virus. Has that attitude diminished any?
I think it has some. Remember, the president told us we were turning the corner and it was going away. And as I said last week, someone in North Carolina is going to die of COVID while we're on this show, and 60 people in the United States will die while we're taping this show. I think that actually, sadly, is going to increase until everybody gets the vaccine, or a large number of people get the vaccine. So I've been very disturbed at how this has become a political or partisan divide, or some show of weakness if you believe in COVID. And I hope we learn this horrible lesson before something else happens in our lifetime.
John, it opened up an issue about our laws, so far as declarations of emergency and the powers of the governor as to how long a state of emergency should exist, whether the governor had to consult with other people in making decisions or not. After what we've experienced this year, are we going to see some new laws?
I think that we'll see attempts at new laws for sure. Just trying to engage more branches of government after emergencies were intended to be short-term, not a year or 18 months or something like that. No one ever intended the emergency laws to apply. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have taken the steps we took, or many of the steps we took, but we're going to have to change these laws.
Joe, we started the year thinking that the big newsmaker of this year was going to be our elections. We held our primaries in March, so the state should have a voice in determining the presidential candidates. It was a long time before November's election. How would you summarize the election outcomes in our state?
I think that the unaffiliated vote in North Carolina is the most underappreciated, underreported, and underestimated thing about North Carolina politics. We're going to continue to be a swing state. We're going to continue to be a state that's going to be up for grabs until the last minute because of the number of unaffiliated voters in North Carolina. It's the second largest political cohort in the state, and I suspect within the next 2 or 3 years it'll be bigger than both the Democratic and the Republican registration. And we need to start paying attention to what the unaffiliated or independent voters in North Carolina. All of the politicians, all the pollsters, everybody underestimated their effect on the elections, not only inside the state, but nationally.
Chris, did the early primaries really have any impact on naming the presidential contestants?
Well, I think in the Democratic, I mean, obviously there was no primary, literally no primary in North Carolina on the Republican side, which I hope is not a precedent. But on the Democratic side, I do think we played a role after the South Carolina primary, which gave Joe Biden his momentum. It continued here and other places. I think that we did play, I'm not sure how important it was, but North Carolina certainly played a role in Biden's nomination.
So, Becki, as a result of the 2020 elections, are we a red state, a blue state, a purple state? What?
We are still very much a purple state. We voted for President Trump. We voted for Roy Cooper. Yes, we are very much a purple state, and we are going to continue to be one of the most important states in the country. Get ready. We've got a U.S. Senate race coming up shortly. All of our legislative races and congressional races will be coming up. So if you like politics, North Carolina is the place to be.
Following the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor murders in our state, we saw protest in big cities and small. In some instances, there was violence. In other instances, police actions were considered heavy-handed. Chris Fitzsimon, racial tensions left the front page shortly after they took place to the virus and to the elections. But simmering below the surface, where are we with racial issues at year end?
Well, I think it's a big undecided. We don't know. I do think it's worth mentioning the majority of protests were not violent. The ones that were, I think, were unfortunate and bad, and that shouldn't happen on either side. But my hope is that what all this did, these horrible tragedies, the murders of people that you mentioned and other African Americans at the hand of police, woke a lot of Americans up. And I think it did to really start examining some of our fundamental institutions and how we treat people with different color skin. It literally is the biggest challenge in a way toward bringing America together is sort of addressing these topics. I'm worried that we've slid back in these last 4 years under President Trump. I hope that the eyes were open to America with all these peaceful demonstrations, especially, and we can make progress next year.
Joe, we saw a lot of discussion about removing Confederate monuments and statues in the state, changing the names of buildings, and as a result of some of the racial tensions. Did they help or did it matter?
I don't think it really mattered. In my opinion, history is history, and how you mark history is really for the future generations. The thing that I would hope comes out of all of this is that we go back to some kind of a national service so that we mix America at the young age of, let's say, 18 to 22. And I think that'll do more than anything else to curb the problems that we're having.
You know, one of the reasons why I love having Joe Mavretic on this show is he's always thinking, original thinking. And you've advocated before that 18-year-olds ought to graduate from high school and serve a year or so of national service of some sort, which is a theme that you're sounding again.
Absolutely. I come from a background of all Marines are green, and it works.
Yeah. With all the turmoil during the year, there was some real concern about the state's economy, our state budget. The big surprise was that our economy came through without a huge downturn, and our state budget has reported a $4.3 billion surplus. John Hood, what's the economy's big impact this year? What's the big story?
Well, I agree with 50% of your setup there, Tom.
I'm doing better than
it was a disastrous economic downturn, no question about it. It's just the revenue numbers didn't come out nearly as badly as people feared, even as recently as early fall. Some of that is because of savings that already exist, but I'm talking not about how much money was left over from last year, the year before, but even the revenue trend this year wasn't as bad as expected. We'll have to see how that affects the 2021 budgeting and so forth, but that was a big story economically, just not as big a fiscal story as was originally anticipated.
Chris, we started off the year in March with an unemployment rate of 4.4%. It ballooned up to 12.9% in May. As we're going into the end of the year at 6.3%. Economists say we've added a lot of new jobs, but they aren't the higher paying jobs that we've lost. How big a yardstick is the unemployment rate in measuring our economy?
Well, I think it's one yardstick, and there are a lot of them. So I think people sometimes the unemployment rate goes down, and it's actually bad news, depending on the numbers underneath the statistics. Sometimes the converse is true, that it goes up, and yet that means more people are actually seeking work and are confident in the economy. So when we see unemployment headlines, we need to be careful and not make that the only measure that we have of how we're doing.
Good point. Our legislature met for the so-called short session this year. They had fits and starts, playing a wait-and-see game with the economy, the pandemic, and the budget. It began with an attempt to override two of Governor Cooper's vetoes. None were. Becki, quickly summarize the legislature's accomplishments and failings of 2020.
Well, Tom, really three things. One, again, with the pandemic really controlling everything, the federal money that came in was distributed over time. They didn't spend it all at one time. They divided it into three different buckets, assessing all the way where the real needs were. Second, they really reined in the growth of state spending. They continued to put money aside in savings so that we've got that as a stopgap, didn't go further into debt. And then third, they tried to put a check on the governor's authority during this emergency management and the authority that he was granted. But as John mentioned earlier, probably not with the intent for this to for months.
All right. We had some problems with your signal there. Hopefully they won't continue. John, we received over $2 billion in CARES Act money from the federal government, and at year's end, there was some concern we weren't going to be able to spend all of it. In fact, the last week or so, we had a $30 million appropriation for broadband expansion throughout the state. Are we going to be able to spend all of this CARES Act money?
Well, it's my understanding the distinction here is between spent and obligated. And we could certainly say that virtually all of it has been obligated. I assume that the federal government is facing similar distinctions in other states, and we're not going to get a whole bunch of money yanked back.
Education always is one of the big topics of each year, and so it was this year. We saw the continued battles between the state superintendent and the state board of elections. Education, however. In March, students were sent home. We attempted virtual learning. The new school year started virtually, but by October, early grades were returning to the classroom. Joe Mavretic, some have said K-12 education took a giant step backwards this year. How would you assess education?
Just the opposite. I think one of the things that's going to happen is that we're going to lose some older teachers who are not embracing the new technologies. And number two, I think we're going to start getting some really hard evidence about what our education system is doing. And I think that's going to be particularly effective and enlightening with regard to dropout rates in K-12.
Becki, let's massage that just for a second. Most people have said they think virtual learning has been a disaster and that our kids lost the latter part of the school year. Joe says he thinks we made big improvements. Where do you stand on this?
Well, I think there have certainly been some challenges, and I think there have been opportunities that have been lost as far as administering it as well as it could have been, whether that's having teachers in place who really, their teaching style lends itself well to virtual learning. Also, I think that because this happened so quickly that many students were not prepared, didn't have the background and enabled to transition well to the online learning. And then, of course, another thing that we've seen across the state is the broadband connectivity is not equal across the state. So many of our students in the rural areas are falling even farther behind. So there's certainly some opportunities moving forward to look at online learning as a tool, but we need to do it better moving forward.
EdNC presented a report to Judge David Lee, who took over the supervision of the Leandro case, Chris. They're recommending that we increase expenditures for public education by $800 million or so a year. Where are we with that? The legislature pretty much poo-pooed that recommendation.
Well, I hope we have a session where we can have hearings and they can explain those recommendations. I do think money is not the only answer, but I do think we need more funding in a lot of areas that have been cut over the past few years, especially in terms of support personnel, helping kids who are struggling. There's a lot of things in education we know how to do them. We just haven't funded them adequately.
And John, we saw some big changes in the university system in North Carolina throughout this year. First of all, a new president, Peter Hans, was installed as president of the system. We also saw a change of leadership in the UNC Board of Governors. From all appearances, it looks like things kind of calmed down so far as the turmoil that we saw within the university system. Is that a pretty accurate reading?
Yes, it certainly did calm down, but that doesn't mean there aren't lots of conversations going and big issues facing the system in 2021. I think the leaders are focused on those, and we should expect to see a lot of news coming out of UNC in the coming months.
Yeah, there are big financial issues in higher education all the way around. I want to move now to our Tar Heel for the year. For many years, NC Spin has talked about the newsmakers. We've named our NC Spin Tar Heel of the Year. We ask our panelists to give us their nominations for the year. We've gotten many suggestions. Joe, give us yours.
I think a rising star is Pryor Gibson. The governor threw him into the unemployment insurance mess, and Pryor resolved that.
All right, John, let's move to yours.
Well, I got to say, Tom, that this is really not going to be up to you. The panelists, the production crew, the entire NC Spin family believes there is only a single obvious choice for Tar Heel of the Year 2020, and that's you, Tom Campbell.
No way. I'm not. I appreciate. I'm honored, but I appreciate that. Becki, who's yours?
I'm going to make it go with John. It's got to be you. Not just, but I would add not Tar Heel of the Year, Tar Heel of the last 2 decades.
Oh,
Thank
wow.
you, Tom.
Oh, don't get me upset, emotional. Chris, yours.
Well, I think I was thinking of early on. I thought I might say Mandy Cohen, but I think that I'll have to since this is the last show. What a great way to go out to agree with John Hood and Becky Gray. I think
How unusual!
Tar Heel of the Year is Tom Campbell.
Yeah. All right.
Oh my gosh! Now I've got to go and switch my vote too.
All right. Okay. I'm going to tell you who the Tar Heel of the Year award is. I get the final voice in this one. Not a North Carolina native. Went to school at Cornell. Graduated at May at Yale. Neither one of which played good basketball, by the way. Came to North Carolina in 2017 with Governor Cooper. Mandy Cohen has to be the North Carolina Spin Tar Heel of the Year. We want to end this last show with some panelists. Joe, very quickly, give us some reaction.
First of all, I think, Tom, that you have shown that North Carolina can have debate without being nasty about it.
All right, let's hear from our panelists.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard what the media and the politicians have to say about North Carolina topics. Now let's get the correct North Carolina spin from our panelists.
NC Spin, I believe, will be remembered mostly for the variety of panelists who appear on the show. Different philosophies, different positions on different issues, but all done in the spirit of cordiality.
The particular discussion I remember on NC Spin was one of my first shows, and it's when Chris Fitzsimon and John Hood got in the most ferocious fight over some issue I've ever could imagine. I mean, these guys were yelling at each other across the table, and I'm sitting there and I looked at Tom, and he just has this slight grin on his face and watching them go at it. And so I was just horrified. I thought, this is not going to come across very well to the viewing audience. And yet there they were. And then I was amazed that after we went off set and everybody was going home, they walked out together, slapped each other on the back and said, this was a great show tonight, wasn't it?
I think the legacy of NC Spin is easy to state, perhaps, but it's probably hard to fully appreciate the significance of it. And the legacy is that we have demonstrated you can have strong opinions, you can choose difficult, challenging, controversial topics, you can have spirited discussion, but you don't have to act like a bunch of jackasses. In this current environment, those combinations don't seem possible, and yet we've shown over 2 decades they're quite possible. This is not a sedate show where everybody just sort of pulls on their chins and turns and agrees with each other. That's not the kind of show this is. This is a show full of disagreement, representing all the different points of view in North Carolina, and yet it represents North Carolina in another sense, the ability of North Carolinians, even as they disagree, even as they have some fundamentally different ideas about what to do, still have a shared sense of what it means to be a North Carolinian and a shared hope for a better North Carolina in the future.
Well, invariably, when I am out in public and people will see and recognize me from NC Spin, one of the things they always say is they either say, I agree with you and John Hood is wrong, or I agree with John Hood all the time and you're wrong, but they always follow that with, I appreciate how you guys talk to each other and I appreciate the tenor of the debate, and it's nice to be able to turn on a television show, hear about the politics and the policies happening in North Carolina without people calling each other names or screaming. And I think they really, people across North Carolina, I think, have come to appreciate the civil discussion. It's one of the few places you can turn on, hear people be respectful, but also get a lot of information about what's happening in North Carolina.
One of the greatest joys of NC Spin has been the many friends that I've made over the years. Even people that I disagree with on many of the important issues. There's just a tremendous respect among the NC Spin family.
When I'm walking around, people will stop me and they'll say, where have we met? And I'll be like, do you know my mom? Do you live in Raleigh? Have you ever been to Burlington? And then they'll go, no, I know, you're on television. And I was like, oh yes, I'm very fancy. And then they'll lean in, and I think they're going to ask me how did I get to be on television? And they invariably ask the same question. What are Tom Campbell, John Hood, and Rufus Edmondson really like? And it always makes me laugh because I think each of those people has their own following. I mean, obviously Tom is adored for the balance he brings and the excitement he brings to covering issues of the day in North Carolina in a very deep and thoughtful fashion.
People make sure they check in and watch because they know they will get unfettered news, they will get strong, intelligent opinion, albeit sometimes contrary, but nonetheless they'll get it. And the show makes them think. And it should also make them proud to be North Carolinians. So what do people say to me? They enjoy NC Spin, they love it, they're dedicated to it, and they want more of it. That's what they say to me.
I'm often talked to by people about Spin, and I've been on since the beginning, and I frankly enjoy hearing people talk about it. It's a show that I dearly love.
We hope you've enjoyed our spin on North Carolina issues. Come back next week when we take on 4 brand new topics and give you North Carolina spin.
And we can go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, cue.
When we started NC Spin September 8, 1998, we never knew this journey would last more than 22 years and 1,154 shows. During this time, we've been honored that you have welcomed us into your homes, and we've appreciated your comments, good and bad. We've had the opportunity to visit with people like a U.S. Senator, congressmen, governors, university presidents, business and religious leaders, along with elected and appointed leaders in government. We've been surrounded by smart and articulate and dedicated panelists who've offered opinions about in-depth issues important to our state, offerings that were civil and honest and balanced. They are the true stars of NC Spin. And I can't name all of these wonderful people, but I do want to thank our founding panelists, John Hood and Chris Fitzsimon. We've treasured the underwriting support from civic-minded organizations who were willing to put their resources into making sure that public policy discussions were broadcast in North Carolina, especially the North Carolina Farm Bureau, the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians, and the North Carolina Electric Membership Co-ops. And we learned early on that the people behind the camera are perhaps more important than those of us in front. And we've been blessed to have a long-standing crew from our 19 years on WRAL. I wish I had time to mention all their names, but I have to single out our director for more than 16 years, Clarence Williams, who breathed the life into NC Spin and helped create the look that you've seen for so many years. In addition, our production team at UNC TV has put new energy into this show, especially since having to deal with the virus this past year, and they are invaluable friends. And I have to mention Nick Fuchs, who came in off vacation to produce this last show for us. I also have to thank the Carolina broadcasting team of Richard Campbell, Cynthia Whitaker, Matt Corey, and Giordano Restelli. Our television crew and our show is ending, but we'll still produce our weekly newsletter and post pieces on our website, ncspin.com, and ncspin on Facebook. Saying goodbye is too hard, so like always, I'll just ask you to stay informed and watch out for the spin. In more than 21 years on NC Spin, I never endorsed a product or sponsor, but I volunteered to do this message for family physicians. Over the past 40 years, my family doctor could quickly diagnose my illnesses because he knew my medical history. Evidence suggests I'll live longer, have a higher quality of life, and save 33% on health care costs. I believe in my trusted relationship with my family physician.
Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Your life is more flexible and efficient than ever, and your energy is too. See how North Carolina's electric cooperatives are building a brighter future for the rural communities we serve at ncelectriccooperatives.com/brighter.
Quality public television is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC TV.